think we'll get started with our workshop. So we have three topics to discuss during our workshop. We have staffing linkage process, staffing process linkages. We'll have a quick break to excuse anybody who may want to leave, and then we'll talk about the board self-assessment. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Engel and Mr. Wenthe about the staffing processes.
Yeah, we're in the staffing season right now. March is when we're putting together budgets and thinking about next year. If we're hiring for next year, we want to get those postings out right around now so that we get good candidates to fill positions for next year. That's the typical way that the teaching world thinks about these jobs. There's some things like administrative assistants or custodians or IT. Those hirings can happen at any time during the year, and the pool of candidates is generally similar regardless. Matt and I were talking about like how to talk about staffing, and we thought we'd first kind of go through this worksheet to kind of highlight some of the conundrums we face when we're doing this. It's not as easy as just like count up the number of kids, divide by 25, and make a decision. It gets a little bit more complicated.
There's a lot of perspectives out there too. I appreciate your comment, Deb, about being in a management role and having the employees sometimes seeing things a little differently, because as we do the staffing, there's a lot of perspectives.
And so our handbook kind of puts together some recommendations for class size that we try and follow to the best of our ability. And that language is there on that little worksheet there, 6.03 class size. In self-contained classrooms, the district average enrollment should not exceed 25 students in K3 or 30 students in K8, and the same for high school, should not exceed 30 except in situations that are individualized. That said, our targets are a little bit less than that. We've received SAGE or AGR aid for many years to keep our class sizes lower, and so our target at the elementary level in K3 is 18-1, and in 4th through 8th grade it's 25-1. And then when we're talking about 9 through 12, we have some different considerations, but generally we're trying to hit 25 and even up to 30-1, depending on the circumstances of that class. Now, the caveat to that is there are some classes where it needs to be a little bit smaller for safety reasons. And so if you're of a lab class for anatomy and physiology and you're doing lots of dissections, you might want that to be a little bit smaller. If you're in a food science class where you're doing lots of cooking and it needs more personal attention and there's gas and flames, you might want it to be a little bit smaller. So those are some of the classes where we might have it smaller than 25 to accommodate.
It's also the average too. So if you have, let's say, 60 kids, and you're knowing that 30 is within the guidelines, sometimes it's almost impossible to get 30 and 30. It might be 32 and 28, something like that.
And so we thought we'd start off with the easier sort of scenario with our middle school there. And so our question is for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, given these benchmarks and our kind of target of 25, max of 30, how many classrooms would you put for each of those grades? And so we've got 6th grade with 125 students, 7th grade with 115, and a slightly larger 8th grade with 140 students. And so you might pull out your calculator, maybe you're good at mental math, but we're kind of curious, as a collective process, like what are you thinking for the number of classrooms for each grade?
6th grade's easy.
What would be your target there?
If the goal is 25, 125 kids, that's 5. That's
Pretty easy,
easy one.
straightforward, right on our target.
We look at the whole grade range, and we average that.
Yep, so like for 6th grade, we'd be trying to average,
So we're not looking at the average of 25-1 for 4 through 8. We're looking at each grade level.
each grade level.
Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
generally each grade level.
Yeah.
7th grade, I'd say about 5 as well, because you have too many students for 4.
Are we factoring in that there's 2 middle schools?
Not in this case, we're dumbing it down, making it a little bit silly. This is one of the
Thank you.
buildings.
This is, yeah, and so for 8th grade, I would probably say 6, just because we have too many students for just 5.
Right.
I mean, ideally, and I think that's what this is all about, right, is in the ideal world, this is what we would like, but now let's translate it into reality. What does that mean?
It would only be around 28 if you went with the smaller size for each of those. It'd still be under the 30. It's only 3 more kids per classroom.
But they're 8th graders.
I consider 7th grade sometimes, both based on where kids are at developmentally, and it's the hinge point. It's sometimes the armpit of middle school.
We'll take 3 of those for one.
Yeah, the middle grades, those teachers are special. Matt was a middle school principal for many years. I have extra respect for middle school principals and middle school teachers.
Some good stories from those years.
And there will be a teacher then that says, well, we have, 25 in my 6th grade classroom, but in 7th grade, they've only got 23. It's not fair.
Here's our clinics. The numbers don't always work out. I mean, you gotta work with what, I mean, that's why there's difference of opinion between staff, because they see what they see in two kids is 10% of a classroom, and so I can see why to the teacher it makes a difference, but as administration and as, you have to make a different kind of decision because you're working with limitations and you've gotta
Yep.
be
Well,
realistic.
and to build off that point, 2 kids can make a difference. One of the things we'll hear sometimes is, like this is a class that has a really high special ed population. There's some really big behaviors in this class. You said 5, but we really need 6 sixth grade teachers. This is not a those are the types of arguments that we hear and have to factor in.
Well, behaviors are a huge thing, right?
Right.
Like, I taught in Japan and I didn't have a single classroom under 40 kids.
Wow.
But we had the worst behavior issue we ever had was the kid falling asleep at his desk. There were no behavior issues, so it made it easy, right? But like, when you've got all those distractions, you need a smaller class size. So that's the equity focus, right? Like, making sure kids have the tools they need to succeed, and a tool is attention.
Absolutely. Teacher attention, one-on-one opportunities, smaller group things. And on the flip side of that, if you've got a class or a classroom that has fewer challenges, maybe it can add 2 or 3 kids and it won't be as big a deal. All right, let's move to the high school. So how many sections for each course? We've got a welding with 31 kids signed up, AP US History with 32, 10th grade biology at 140, and 9th grade English at 130.
Welding has to be 2.
3.
I think 3?
Yeah, well, they probably,
10 to
we
1
probably aren't
roughly,
rich
yeah.
enough to have welding devices for 31 kids. So, we probably need classrooms of like 10 kids each room.
I think there's capacity issues, right? How much equipment do you have in order to have
Dangerous.
students present? But also, you're gonna have a lot more safety issues to deal with in a welding class than maybe in a US history class. So I
Those are
think the
really heavy
smaller.
textbooks in AP US History.
Well,
It only hurt for a second.
In welding, typically we're looking for 15 to 1 in classrooms that have like higher safety needs, but we're at that 31 mark, so is there enough equipment to share? Is there enough supervision available? Those are realistic concerns. And they probably won't be split evenly either, like when you start thinking like kids' schedules.
When you're building the schedule, one of the things you do is that conflict matrices to see who signed up for what and what we talked oftentimes you can't run the AP classes opposite band or choir because there's too many conflicts. I remember we had one situation at the old school I was at where we had a really unique kid who signed, it was the only time we had a conflict between Auto Tech 2 and AP calculus. He was in both, and that oftentimes we could always run those. Well, then it was one of those, what is this kid gonna do? So it's, creating that conflict matrices and looking at best schedules too.
Yeah,
But
the
you
one-offs
can
are
rarely
hard.
get them even.
Were you able to resolve that?
No.
For
he
one
had to choo-
student?
He had to
Yeah.
choose. I mean,
Yeah.
that was
Schedule
ultimately,
opens first.
yeah.
And even if you go with welding, divide by 2, 2 sections, it might be 18 in one and 13 in another, depending on how that plays out. Then you start to run into those
18 or
concerns.
14. Yeah.
So you might run under that 15 to 1, that's your benchmark, simply because you're trying to, there's not only the averages, there's also like the high water mark. Like, how are we meeting all of those various needs?
And also, how many students do you need minimally in order to run a section?
Right.
Because you could split them, but then you may not have enough to run one section.
So I'll give you an example of that. We have a robotics class. The numbers aren't at 18, but yet we want to run it in that class. Britta will tell you that's one of the classes that's part of the pathway. Oh, I forget the,
FANUC robotics certification.
yes. So if, to do this, we need to offer that as a class, and yet we only have 15 signed up. Well, we're going to run it.
So now we've got a welding class split 3 ways. One of those classes is only 10 in size, and then the AP US history teacher is looking at that and asks, well, how many sections do I get?
Does he have kids using time?
Yeah.
No, but
One.
you
You
will
would
get
hope
the
that they
argument
would
about the
recognize
amount of
that
correcting,
difference.
the amount of prep work, and if I've got this upper level class, I mean, there's a ton of correcting that goes on. They're not wrong, just another perspective.
And the challenge sometimes is if you split AP US history, even welding to 3 sections, it's an overload now. It's not like they have time in their schedule naturally, and so now you're paying an extra $7,500 that year for them to work an extra section, which is reasonable for the compensation, but it does stress your system just a little bit.
Yeah.
10th biology at 140.
5.
5?
You have 28 students in each,
Yeah.
if it all works out beautifully, which it never does.
Well, the consideration for labs.
Yep, you consider labs, materials that you need. If it's 5, that's a full-time job for one teacher. One person could have 1 prep all day. If it's 6, they either have to teach an overload or 2 teachers have to take it. So now somebody has 2 preps. So now somebody's teaching AP biology and a 10th grade, so they've got to prep for 2 different things instead of one teacher prepping for one thing each. Those are different things to consider.
Nobody wants one prep all day.
No. But it's also.
I would agree with you, some people don't.
But it's also how big are our biology labs, how many seats are available, and most of those lab courses are going to have capacity issues that you just can't go above because of physical limitations more so than your staffing requirements.
Of course, the other part of this is the staffing part. Let's say you've got 5 people in a department, and you're trying to come up with, 5 sections for each of those people. Well, now you find you're 1 section short. Are you gonna have somebody at 80%, or are you gonna split one of these big classes into another section just to maintain full-time employment? You don't wanna have good people leave because they're only 80% FTE.
Well, that causes a bigger issue if they do leave,
Of
right?
course, yeah, then it's a turnstile of teachers, so.
Right.
And then, of course, this is the thing that we see all the time, is that kids sign up for classes, and we do our schedule.
And they
Well,
switch.
then they decide, you know what, I think I'd rather be in this class,
I
and all of a
broke up with
sudden.
my significant other over break, and we're not together anymore, and I don't want to have all my classes with them. And
So, the classes that we see or the enrollment we see in February is not always the enrollment we see in September. There's been a shift one way or the other, and so you want to allow a little bit of room for that, hopefully going up, not going down.
How much change do you see with seniors who have most of their credits fulfilled but have to sign up for a minimum and then also sign up for the college courses and then drop some of their classes at school? How much does that impact?
I know there's some, I'd want to talk to the counselors or the principals to get I don't know the number offhand. The other thing is, you sign up for things, and then because of that conflict matrices, not everything works out the way you want, and all of a sudden we're sticking you in a class that I didn't sign up for that. I don't
Yeah.
want to be in that section, but yet I know I can't be in this other one. So that's a common thing too. I will say, since this is my 4th year here, one of the biggest changes that's happened was we changed release time, and that made a big difference as far as number of kids taking electives. That's a positive change. Rather than, leaving school and playing video games, now kids are taking classes that, they may not have taken otherwise. So our elective numbers have changed. And Britta Rodering will tell you too that our CTE classes have really seen, while we're trying to reduce overall, I know that in CTE we've had additions every year.
yeah.
And add on to Katie, what you were saying, you have colleges advising those seniors, you need to take a more rigorous schedule. You
Correct.
need to
Yeah.
get into those upper division classes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and to go back to your comment about that 80% instructor and having to potentially split a class, my assumption is that could also be what we're seeing in our HR report when we're talking about changes in assignment and we see people
Always.
going up or going
Yeah.
down, and it's that fluctuation in the schedule.
So, without saying too much, I can tell you that we have a new Hmong teacher this year who's doing a great job, and his numbers are going up in Hmong, which I'm so happy about. It's me, that's pragmatic. I mean, I'm glad to see that as a language taught in La Crosse schools. But it's impacting our numbers in Chinese. So our Chinese numbers are going down a little bit. We had 1.4 or 1.6, I forget what it was, but now we're gonna have one full-time, and then the other person is gonna take on more EL, that was her other half next year. We'll see how things go, but she may be 0.2 Chinese, she might be 0. And then EL will take up the rest of that.
Yeah, and when I started off as a teacher, having a teacher that was 0.87 was not uncommon. I would say in almost every department, depending on the school district I was in, like, I want to stay at this school, take a reduction this year, hopefully it's full-time next year. Teachers have a lot more choice than they used to. And so you don't see that very commonly any longer, because if they're not full-time, they'll go find a job where they can be. There's plenty of options. And so we're trying to find ways to be efficient and frugal, but also keep great people, because we are not going to find a 0.87 anyway who has one section missing from their day.
Has the district ever done something, for example, assuming that 0.8 teacher, there's no way to really make up that person to be full-time? Has there ever been a situation where that person is told, well, if we could have you teach something during the summer school time, we would count that as part of your full-time load?
We haven't gone the summer school route, but we've, like I mentioned with the Chinese person, they were teaching EL.
We find
as their
something
other,
else that they're
so,
certified in?
Yeah.
Where it,
Or can get a license with stipulations to
Sure.
teach something else too. So we've done a little bit of that.
it's not one of our scenarios, but our specials at the elementary level are a particular challenge.
Mhm.
And so a full-time position is 18 sections, but with declining enrollment in our elementary schools, we have a lot of folks that are at 14, 15, 16. And so they'll have like 2 holes in their day at 16 sections. So 2 days out of 3, they have a gap of an hour where they're not fully employed, quote unquote. And so you're trying to figure out how to productively use that person 2 days out of 3 in your building. And they can do interventions and duties and other things. If it gets down to 15, they have a full hour gap all week long. Now we start to think about, can they teach an art class at the high school? Can they help out with FIAD at the AM, start their day at Longfellow, and then go over to Spence? Teachers hate that, by and large.
Some actually,
Okay.
some like just the difference they get in a day, but there are others that, like, I didn't sign up to teach seniors. I'm not comfortable with 17-year-olds. I like the littles.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, is finding the right people that are willing to do both. But we have quite a few. We've gravitated more toward helping alleviate the overloads at the high school in art, music, FIAD. And we used to have some of those people going to JDC, the Juvenile Delinquent Center.
Detention center.
We're not, there's so few kids there. There's 4 kids. And the teachers who are there have a license where they can do every subject already. So rather than push them there, we're sending them to Central. You're doing vocal lessons, and that has flexibility. You can do, work around your schedule. Or you're going to start your day with FIAD and then come back. We have a excellent FIAD teacher at Northwoods who coaches at Logan, so it works out well that she can end her day at Logan and then go straight into coaching.
So I'm assuming for 9th grade English, we're all gonna say 5.
Yep.
Seems about right. All right, the tough part is elementary school, where we don't have as much volume as we do at the high schools and the middle schools. And here at the elementary schools, where we're particularly starting to think about an equity strategy, we're looking at free and reduced lunch, we're looking at special ed numbers. But with the numbers being so low, it creates dramatic differences between buildings. And they talk. They have grade level meetings at least monthly. And so, they see what it's like in one building versus another. Our higher poverty schools have title support that our lower poverty schools do not. So not only do they have different class sizes, they have more supports. And so those ones at the bottom are where it gets a little more difficult. And you can see at East, it has kind of district average or below district average, free and reduced. At West, it's district average, free and reduced. And at Midtown, it's higher than the district average, and the special ed rate climbs at each of those, which is typical as well. You know, so a classroom of 36, or a class of 36 at East. You know, our target is 18 to 1. Seems pretty logical to have 2, right? You know, it's a lower poverty.
But it could be 24 and 12, depending upon the composition of special ed kids and behavioral issues.
Certainly feel that way. At the elementary level, it's typically evenly
Pretty,
divided,
yeah.
but the number of students in special ed might be different in each based on, and because it's in a contained setting, we can distribute those, you know, to our desire as well. And one might be smaller or larger based on what you said. Like, we're gonna have fewer kids here because they got a student that's really challenging.
Teachers used to come into the office and say, I'll take 3 extra students, but I need this student out here.
Wow. Yeah, my dad, as the Title I teacher in the school, was the mediator. And there was a little bit of horse trading in order to
Yes,
like get the
yes.
right composition so that every kid could succeed. You know, that was the
And
intent.
sometimes that works, I mean, really.
Yep.
Sometimes it's a conversation too, where this kid can't be with this kid, and this kid
Oh,
can't be
yeah.
with that
Yep.
kid, and they're cousins, and they don't get along, and there's some bad blood in the
Absolutely.
family, and
Yep.
then it gets very challenging to try to make a classroom.
Second grade, what's the answer? 44.
I'm gonna say 2.
22, 2 classrooms, lower poverty. It's within our handbook guidelines, if a little outside our target.
I'm gonna do 3.
Because here, if we're,
And you can't use just poverty as an indicator, though. I mean, there's some pretty,
There's behaviors everywhere.
Yep.
Behaviors everywhere. So there's a
Say 3.
preference for 3, potentially.
We're gonna cost you a lot of money.
Welcome to staffing.
Well, once we get done with all of our initial impressions, then I tell Matt, hey, you need to cut $250,000 next year, so who's going?
here again, there could be 2, but you put a teacher assistant in each room.
And there's that as well. That's something, you know, the organizational pattern, the use of teacher assistants, the types of students and other services provided, those make a difference as well. We've talked about at the kindergarten level, do we start going to full-time TAs in kindergarten because of the early childhood behaviors that we're seeing, that we have historically done in 4K, but do we elevate that to kindergarten? We might have to accept higher class sizes in order to accomplish that based on the cost involved, though.
is there a specific formula for how the presence of a teacher's aide should impact the staffing ratio? Is it just, it's just vibes?
Well, and, you know, it's, not every TA is the same.
Right.
When I have seen some schools have guidelines where in 4K, up to 15 kids, it's just the teacher. From 16 to 20, it's a teacher and a TA, and at 21, we split the class and go to 2 teachers, no TA. But
But there's so many variables. I
So many
wouldn't
variables.
want to be locked into I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
be locked into that, because there's so many variables in any given
Interesting.
situation.
so at West, 57. Is that 3 classrooms?
4.
Man, yeah, Jim.
I mean, 3 to 4.
Well,
Learn that
if you
Jim
can
is mean.
split with another grade, with
I
the
was
other
just
grade.
thinking
Sometimes
that.
we need teacher assistants.
That's definitely like 3
Yeah.
times many, like people literally
I
pull
mean, they
them
help
If you
out
can-
a lot.
Because he says about here, you can split with the grade, so I would do 3 plus a split with the second graders.
We've definitely done splits in the past.
We have.
It's a common practice in lacrosse. It's multi-grade classrooms are a standard practice in SOTA and in Cooley Montessori. It's a part of the instructional program. It's intentional. It's a desired outcome so that kids can learn from each other at different grade levels. It's less desirable when you're doing it just to accommodate class size because it's not part of an intentional philosophical program. So you're just doing it to manage staffing.
Especially when you're looking at the reading levels and OG.
And at the lower elementary, we're finding it's harder to do well because of the range of needs of kids. And if you take the highest readers from first grade and the lowest readers from second grade, that's not a good strategy either. And so you would like a heterogeneous group, but now you're trying to teach, kids that are functionally kindergartners all the way to some that are functionally third graders, and that's just a real challenge. At the upper elementary, it's easier.
I was gonna say, we've done 4 or 5 splits are a little bit easier, but those K1 is awful.
Oh,
K1 is awful. 1, 2 isn't great,
Yeah.
and that's the challenge.
There's
And
clear
this-
benefits and detriments.
This doesn't help staffing necessarily, but I think it's a successful thing if the teacher agrees to it, and that's looping.
Yes, the looping with a good teacher is a great strategy. The research shows that if you have, one mediocre to underperforming teacher in your elementary career, not a problem. But if you get 2, particularly back to back, that can be a real challenge.
What's looping?
It's when the teacher follows the kids from first grade to second grade, so they all go together as a
Second,
cohort.
Third or
It's just
fourth,
good
from one
thing
grade to
with the
another.
kids.
Can you guys send a bottle of water over this way, please? Thank you.
So
Based on-
West second grade, we got 60 kids.
Say 4,
3.
3.
3 to 4.
Jim thinks 3.
Which one?
Second grade and West.
4.
I would say so too,
Well,
but Jim is making,
Come on, Jim.
really, I mean,
It's typical to the school district in terms of free and reduced lunch and special ed. 3 sections would be just 2 above our target. 4 would be 3 below.
Again, definitely if there was one class of the 3 that was more, the teachers struggled with more of the students, then I would definitely add a teacher assistant. Rather than go
That I would say, I agree in theory, but it's right now one of the hardest positions to fill.
TAs, yeah.
TAs are hard to find right now.
So we can post the position, we might never
Yeah,
find
yeah.
the person.
yeah, we look at
but-
our HR report
Yep.
today, all the
That,
vacancies.
those things that are on there, I mean, it's 4 of them are TAs at the moment. And,
Yep.
the deaf and hard of hearing teacher is the one that's gonna be there the whole year.
Yeah, and I wonder if for instance, some of those people that were TAs were given the encouragement to become teachers, the way that one of those state proposals indicate. That might help that whole situation.
that's where I think you might have more of an opportunity to have 4 teachers and splitting this into 4 rather than 3 in a TA, only because of the challenges, but that's also gonna cost the district more in order to do that.
And then Midtown, first grade.
2.
2 in first grade, 11 each.
I probably would combine,
I don't think this can have one, I mean, that's,
well, you could,
You may not.
you could. Again, the average is 18, doesn't mean that it has to be 18,
Check.
it's not a maximum.
right, but I mean, if we're.
Well, at that
we're
rate, it's
thinking of-
probably a, what's it called? With 75% free and reduced lunch, it has the category,
Yeah.
Title I, thank
Title
you,
I
so you
funds,
probably
yeah.
can't exceed 18.
You could.
You could?
Yep.
May you?
Is it still based on averages there? Cause if we're asking the East School to have 2 of 22, and then we can break out Midtown into 2 in our, cause it's average across all of them, right?
Generally, looking at the building.
In the building, yeah.
Yeah. I will say that we have noticed with really small groups of kids, things get weird sometimes.
Yeah.
You might have 4 boys, and now, like, you don't have somebody that you identify with or friends with. You might have weird social dynamics with the other kids, We've found that low class sizes aren't a panacea either. I remember having a second grade teacher who was super excited about having a class of 10 one year, and it was her worst year because she could just never get
Oh, I've had
away
that in
from
college
those
classes,
kids.
yeah.
They were always, that kid was always like present and dominating the
Yeah.
classroom. She couldn't have different groups of kids. She only could ever have 3 small groups, and none of them worked. She wanted more kids to create small groups and have more mixing and more opportunity. So even small.
Smaller is not necessarily better.
No, and that's, and we've like seen like the limits of what that can be sometimes.
And yet 22 in a, you know, when you look at some of our elementaries, some of the neighborhoods, it's a lot.
It's too many.
Can't do
Yeah.
it.
That's where I was thinking 1-2 splits across the board in this building.
Yeah.
I mean,
And then 33 at Midtown,
Deuce.
2 would be 16 and 17. And then they'll look down to first grade and they'll say like, but they get 11.
mhm.
Like if we split 3 ways,
Get
we'll
them
get
next
11.
year.
Yeah.
Just
Exactly.
bide your time.
Yeah.
Not as easy.
I don't think you get a lot of those in elementary school. I don't think there's a lot of jealousy in most elementary schools in terms of they only have 15, I have 20.
There's some. We've heard some of it in our linkages.
Just a little.
But more, I think, comparing the lower grades to the upper grades.
If there's a behavioral issue.
Which there is every single time. I mean,
So in terms of our process in general, Matt sits down with the directors of elementary and secondary ed. Matt sits down with the principals. I don't know if you want to describe anything
Sure.
else.
At the secondary level, I meet with the principals and we go through and look at number of sections, determine that, and determine staff, and try to take advantage of attrition when we can. I know that right now Central is gonna have one less science teacher next year. So we're taking advantage of a retirement there. But at the high school level too, I mentioned, the Hmong and the Chinese, we had to change that a little bit. They right now, they're sharing a literacy specialist right now, one person between the two schools. And she's doing her job, and she's making a difference, and they see value in her, and they each want 1.0. And it's hard to argue that the person isn't making a difference, and this is our goal, and this is what we're trying to do, so why wouldn't we increase? So that's one of the things that, factored into discussions. And then, family and consumer education, our numbers keep rising. Our numbers are going up, and kids are finding value in what they're doing. We had a bunch of overloads. We finally just said, let's quit doing all these overloads and just hire one more person. And now we won't have 3 overloads, we'll just have one additional person. And of course, those people aren't growing on trees right now either, so you gotta go early if you're gonna find a face teacher, otherwise you're finding a long-term sub or someone with a license with stipulations or something like that.
At the middle school, it's a little more straightforward.
Yeah, I think our numbers, most grades are around 26-ish. I think one of them is a 23 is the average, but I know how that goes too. On paper, it says 26, and then you have a class of 30 and a class of 22, and
Well, I think, isn't it also determined on what license the teacher may hold? Because you might have
yeah.
a
So middle
6-12.
school's, middle
versus
school's
a-
unique, because you can have people who have a K-8 license, and then they can teach any subject.
Right.
But you might also have someone with a 6-12 language. I have a 6-12 in
Yeah.
English.
And I have a 6-12.
And so both Longfellow and Logan usually have a split where everyone picks up a section of social studies. You might be a math and social studies teacher, or an English and social studies teacher. That's your, and that's how they split things. Well, that's great. Except now I bring in someone who's a great fit, who's gonna help our literacy scores, great English teacher, but they're 6-12 licensed. Well, what are you gonna do with that social studies? And that's where we work on a license with stipulations, or we try to shuffle some things around if we can. But that has implications on the whole schedule then, when you try to do that. You can't just have people rotate the way you wanted them to rotate, because now you got this X factor where they can't rotate in there.
I would also argue that having only one type of license isn't good either, right? Because if you only have just elementary licensed individuals, you don't necessarily have that knowledge base of the 6-12 that you can be brought in to transition students in. And if you only have 6-12 people, well, you don't have the ability to flex, and you don't understand the elementary side of things of where students are coming from, so.
At the 8th grade math level, as a principal, I kind of liked having someone who has a math background. So, that's one of the things you have to look at as well. Now, the other part that makes it a challenge is all the shared staffing you have, because now you're working with multiple schedules. And if you're a middle school, you might have people coming from 3 different buildings into, you know, into your building, and you have to find a way to cooperate and collaborate with all the elementary people.
I would say at the elementary level it's the hardest. We're dealing, like these scenarios at the bottom, it might not even be 22, it might be 21. And you're like, ugh, a split would probably work, except it's 1 and 2, and the needs are high, and
Emerson had 19 and 20 this last year, I think, and that was even at kindergarten, which is high. But it's Emerson, so we said we're gonna do it. At Northside, we had some sections of 11 though, because of these type of numbers.
you know, so balancing that and dealing with the fairness issues that people see, and you know, the number of sections has implications on the specials teachers. You know, if you split it, maybe that'd be full-time locally. If it's not split, then they've got to travel somewhere.
Sometimes team teaching works in the elementary school where 2 of us take all 40 or 30 kids.
Yeah, there's especially at State Road, that's a common practice because they have dividers between their walls that they can open, and so they'll often team teach on lots of things, and it's been a great strategy there.
Miss Valentine did that with me when I was subbing one day, and it was all that saved me that particular day.
And so as we look at staffing for next year, we see opportunities for some reductions in a few areas, you know, but, you know, maybe it's 4 or 5 FTE total. And depending on what we do to support student behaviors at the elementary level, it might start to look like a wash, you know, when it's all said and done. But it's using this exact same process that we did here to try and like do what's best for kids in the classroom, keep full-time staff, accommodate the really significant challenges in some of our schools, while also trying to be ion frugal, efficient. You know, we're trying to reduce where we can, but it's really tough once you start to get down to brass tacks on paper. in the
There's a lot of
classrooms.
strong personalities and a lot of strong perspectives as far as what's best for my school, and you know, some of these sections of, you know, like, how are you gonna split this, and when we round down rather than up, and it reduces the number of sections in the building, we get pushback.
Unless we have more declining enrollment, we lose 36 students at the elementary level, great, but they're split over 7 buildings.
Well, and, right, and it's never one grade. I mean, it's maybe 2 less than this class and 1 less than that class, and it doesn't drastically change what you do. And of course, we have schools too where it's not uncommon where we get a lot of move-ins over the course of the year, where it's more, you know, it's, you know, you might start with 16, but it's gonna go up. And we're not gonna add a teacher mid-year.
Or down, one
Or
day
down.
we lost 9, and by the end of the week, we picked up 11 different ones.
Yep.
I said, for the week, we were 2 down, 2 up.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you for entertaining the staffing discussion. I appreciate the discussion and conversation. Hopefully that provides just a little more awareness as we go through staffing, you know, what our process is. We hope it's perceived as being thoughtful and an eye towards efficiency.
No, I made a meme out of Parker just to be.
That is a puzzle, man.
Already?
Yeah, and it's not easier at the college level.
No, right? When I was doing
Like,
clinical assignments.
Yeah.
I also made a meme out of him.
The last one.
That's Carter.
So I guess our next item, if we move on, is to linkages. Would you like to stay here for that?
I probably
I
have.
can stick around for that one,
It's up to
yeah.
you.
Yeah, I've got, yeah, thank you, man.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.
Thanks, man.
So, I believe Laura put at your seats the linkages for, I believe, the year, correct, Laura? Up to this point?
Of the school year.
Yes.
Yep.
And so, just an opportunity to discuss, as we had talked about, kind of having a overarching review of linkages and what has happened over the past year. So I think we'll give you a little bit of time to just quickly peruse
have two?
those. Looks like this.
I don't know that he has one. I don't have a second one.
Should be at the top, unless people shifted papers. Should have been at the top. Is it behind your computer?
It is.
Good eye.
Found it?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, what I've appreciated about the linkages is, I mean, and given the exercise we just went through and hearing those comments about exactly those things, like, you know, this, at this school level, there may be one class with 50% IEPs, right, versus another, there's only 2 students, and like the lived reality of that, you know, counterpoised with the exercise of having to manage the entire district scheduling and everything, like, that's bonkers.
I think one of the things that I picked up on the linkages that I was at, thinking about the schools that are gonna be affected with the referendum. First of all, the professionalism of staff, considering there's changes that they might not love. I didn't get any sense of anything negative about from any of the staff, even though this is gonna be a hard change for them. I just have to really just comment on the exemplary professionalism of the staff. But they had a lot of questions about working out, particularly if you have a title school and a non-title school, and how does that work, and how, I think how we can get more information to staff, and I know this is early on, but the sooner we can address some of those, I think, as we move towards eventually having the buildings done and staff moving in together, I think it really pulls together those pieces. And of course, the other piece is, how do we build a common culture when there's 2 different buildings coming together, and what can we do to help with that? That's got, I mean, staff didn't really complain about that, but there's certainly differences in culture, and how do we pull that together for staff? I think the big lesson we learned with the closure of the middle school was that it was done quickly, and there wasn't enough attention put together for combining those cultures when you split those staff and kids up into 2 different schools.
I would second that, and I think one of the lessons of the Lincoln closure is actually exactly why we wanted to avoid that with the referendum the way we did it. You know, that was a big talking point about the ability to do this planfully, right? And I liked your initial point too, Deb, and I think that in terms of the professionalism of the staff, what I took away in particular from the Hinchin linkage was their concern is for how are we going to get to be able to keep doing the really good, unique stuff that we've been doing at our school. And I think that's a completely legitimate concern, and hopefully as we're discovering what's the way that we create this new culture, right? What's the synthesis of these 2 schools, and we take those opportunities and that good work and be able to continue it. So.
The other big thing that I got, particularly from the elementary schools, is the behaviors. Like, yes, there's behaviors in every classroom everywhere, but the number of behaviors, the types of behaviors, the number of kids with behaviors, this community isn't prepared or aware of how that has fundamentally shifted, particularly since COVID, and the pressure it's putting on the classrooms and the other students in those classrooms. And I think we as a district need to be talking about, and we as a board need to be talking about, what are we gonna do about that? I think we have to acknowledge it, and then what's our next step? And that's a big thing. There's always been behaviors, but the number of staff saying about how they don't physically feel safe in their buildings many days is alarming to me. And because of these behaviors that are going on, it's part of society, it's not anything we can change, but how are we protecting our staff, how are we protecting other students, how are we addressing students' needs? We have to make some pretty dramatic changes, I think, to really think about that. Because if we don't, we're gonna be hearing that from middle and high school kids more than we already are.
Yeah, as an example of that, like, we have data to back up that trend as well. And at kindergarten, we're finding that our letter sound assessments have gone from like an average of 80% before the pandemic when they show up to 60%. So 20% reduction in the letter sounds that kids know when they're arriving at school. and a similar trend for numeracy, although not quite as bad. Disability rates in kindergarten have risen 3% since the pandemic, so from 12% to 15%. So kind of dramatic increase in the number of kids identified with disabilities. And then office disciplinary records went from 100 in 21, 22 to 882 this year. I mean, these are kindergartners.
That was what?
Disciplinary referrals.
Okay, I
So
just
an
wanted to make sure.
800% increase in 5 years.
I remember many years ago when Jim was at Hamilton, and I had a meeting with him and his staff when I was heading up a nonprofit for kids in this town. And I remember Jerry Wetstein talking about kindergartners coming to school and a teacher telling them where you can sit and when you can sit and when you can get up. And these kids are like, I've been raising myself since birth and my siblings, and now you're gonna tell me what I can do? And that, I found that shocking. But now this isn't an unusual occurrence in any of our schools. And, what's caused that, the little ones looking at technology and what's gone in the world and all, there's so many factors that contributed to it. But we really need to be talking about it and figuring out what we're gonna do about it and telling our community about it, because, we're gonna be asking them for help at some point, and they need to be aware of it. Because we need to keep our kids and our staff safe, and we need to serve those kids that are struggling in a way that helps them.
And we would need to retain our staff because they feel safe coming to work every day. Totally agree. Yeah, I thought that was a big theme that came out, was behaviors at the elementary level, particularly lower elementary, where they hadn't seen these things before.
That's exactly what they've been saying. Every school says we haven't seen it like this before.
A theme I noticed was also benefits, health insurance. We did have a dramatic change last year, and so it certainly showed up. If we have an opportunity to shift trajectory there, we're certainly going to seek that as one of the first things we're looking for, with a new budget.
I wanted to ask about from the LEA linkage, the comment about, the new teacher mentorship program, which I noticed was listed on the cover sheet, that every teacher, 100% of teachers are assigned a mentor. This was September. Cover sheet is, I assume, accurate to like right now. Where are we at with that? And is the mentorship relationship, again, is it systematic? Is there a program behind it, or?
Yep, we've had a program for many, many years that for mentorship. Our staff wasn't in love with what we did last year, so we made changes for this year. We're finding this program didn't meet their needs either, and so we're working closely with representatives from our teachers union to think about what it is that they do want as we move forward. And so it's a work in progress. We recognize the same flaws. We always take teacher feedback and look to make it better. And so looking at changes for next year to see what we can do.
I did get some feedback recently from a couple of teachers I ran into just out and about in the world, that the efforts to reduce the reporting and paperwork load for our operational expectations is appreciated. I think
How
should
do they know?
be ongoing.
How do they
The
know?
grapevine. Our meetings are public.
If one person knows.
And if one teacher knows, as we've heard, everyone knows.
We've also kept the folks that are responsible for gathering data for our results policies, that we're changing, aware of what's going on, and they saw, the board vote for that, and so they're excited for those changes. We've kept them aware, so.
It's nice to be appreciated.
Do they like it? So, and forgive me if I'm misremembering, in our last workshop, linkage workshop, we had been talking about reconfiguring the number of linkages. And so some of what we have here going from like every school building, right, and thinking about the, you know, as difficult as it is to get board members at these meetings, where are we all with that? I mean, that didn't feel like a settled question. Maybe other people remember it differently. Not having a linkage at every single building, but grade levels, you know, or like elementary, middle, high school, and because we also did talk about, you know, the nature of the linkages themselves, and while I think in general we all agree that like having that ear to the ground is really important and that mechanism for feedback, understanding how it conditions the work that we're doing under our governance model is also important, and the time that we're committing to these things.
So our current process is that we do, well, maybe it's not. Do we do both high schools with staff and students, or do we do one high school with staff one year and one the other year?
Well, technically, there are 3 high schools now, in a
Yes, that's
sense.
right, thank you, good point.
I can pull up,
Is it a 3-year?
it's varying,
It's a
yeah,
3-year
so it's a
cycle,
3-year
It's a
cycle,
third,
and
a
so I
third, a
believe
third.
the high schools are on different years.
Yes.
And then we do a third of the elementaries, so, yeah, we don't do every,
We don't do every school every year,
No.
but my understanding of our conversation was that doing more regular but more aggregated.
So in the past, we've done a third, a third, a third. Once the pandemic hit, what we heard from teachers was, you haven't come to my building in a long time and we've got a lot to say. But it was also the pandemic, so we weren't going to buildings, but also it wasn't going to be in their cycle anyway. You know, that we were still in that 3-year cycle, and they went in 2019 and they wanted us to come back in 21. It's like, well, actually, you're slated for 22. So there's been some of that, and that's where we created this all elementary, all middle, all high school, because we kept hearing from people like, you've not come to our building in a long time. It really only had been a year. So we did that, but they were very poorly attended. I mean, we might have had 2 or 3 people
Yeah.
show up to those. So there's good and bad with having just all level, because you may not get the same level of insight that you currently get by having required staff meetings in the building where people are showing up in order to talk to the board. So there's that. I would also link this back to what we were talking about earlier with linkages, where we're having trouble even having a full contingent of board members, meaning 3, attend the linkages. We'll also see, as we do our self-assessment, that there's comments about committees. Well, again, committees are still outside of the regular board meeting, so if we're having challenges and even attending linkages, you know, we're asking for more and more of our board outside of a regular board meeting. So I think that the board has to struggle with that in the future of how much do we want to expect board members to do outside of normal board meetings. And that's something that the board will have to grapple with as they move forward with their new leadership in April and May.
And the only thing that I would say about linkages is that thinking about that, how coherent governance is structured with the board being the direct relationship to the community, those are the linkages I think have the most value for the board from my perspective, is that connection to the community, whether it's youth serving organizations or city council or county board or, you know, parent groups in the community. Like, those are the linkages I think, you know, fit into that model and have the most potential value in terms of like knowing what the values of the community are, ensconcing those in policy and monitoring and holding the district accountable to those things. Staff is certainly valuable. I definitely see an opportunity for that. As I expressed earlier, meeting with LEA, you know, has been super valuable for us in terms of joint leadership, and that more holistic view of the district I find more impactful and actionable than kind of some of the one-offs that you might get from a narrower group of folks. But that's my perspective.
I do think our linkages are staff heavy right now, and I do think connecting more with the community is important, and businesses and other kinds of groups. I agree with that. I also hear that not all staff are in complete lockstep with the LEA, so the LEA kind of represents them, but kind of maybe doesn't. So having conversations with the LEA and the other groups, I think, is helpful for us to get a better sense of what's, again, a lot of what I get out of the staff linkages is, gives me an idea of what it's like to be in their shoes for a while, and how hard their jobs are, and what's going on in the classrooms, because if I don't understand that, I can't do a good job here.
And
Yeah,
I'll- I was just gonna say, and we also have to remember as board members that you don't have all staff present at linkages.
Right.
You don't have teacher assistants, you don't have administrative assistants, you don't have a number of people who might be hourly. So, also consider that we are only hearing from a part of the employee groups and not all employees. So, think about that as you think about linkages as a whole.
I think that context is important because any particular meeting with any particular group is not fully representative, and it's never going to be. So like having those touch points, to go back to Juan, what you were saying just before about, the pros and cons of having like poorly attended all elementary school ones. Like, well, I get it because they're just more likely to come to their building, right? And to have it be a session that is focused on their building, I think they would understand that if I'm with all of the elementary schools, like, well, my particular concerns of my building may not, find enough space in that conversation. And I think that's a fair concern, obviously, right? I think, Deb, like you were saying about or Juan, actually, sorry, about wrestling with the amount of commitment that we're asking of everyone, right? And like to the point where, does that need to get spelled out in our board member roles, our job description, right? Because right now it's just sort of on the sense that we all want to do a good job, right? And what that requires from time to time will ebb and flow. Like obviously there was a lot more around the referendum, right? And since then, it's calmed down quite a bit, right? And maybe that's okay. I mean,
I like the idea of maybe providing more clarity of that in our policies or bylaws or whatever on expectations.
well, it might help prospective candidates too. Think about, can I commit to this? And
Well-
if I'm going to commit to this.
Well-
But at the same time, that's another hurdle. That's another barrier
Yeah.
for a lot of individuals. And
And
Especially,
Well, you couldn't compel an elected official to attend any meeting.
Correct.
Yeah, ultimately, you could censure them, but that's the extent of it. So there are some like legal limitations as well.
yeah, I think just back on our meetings with the Aspen group and their opinions about languages and their value in a coherent governance model, and not being something that they would necessarily recommend doing at all. And then to have an expectation clearly stated of potential board members that if they get on the board, they're expected to attend these things that are usually during, if you work a traditional workday, during your workday.
that's what's hard for me, exactly.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely get it.
Well, and, just to be clear, at least in the times that I've done the prospective board meetings in December, for people who are thinking of running, the question has always come up. So what's the time expectation?
Right.
And it's like, well, I can tell you that there's first and third Mondays. I can tell you usually they're 6 to 9, but there's other commitments like preparing for the board meeting. There's linkages. There's, other meetings that we may have. If there's committees, there's committees. So I mean, it's not necessarily spelled out, and that also gets set as the new board gets seated, right? So it's not necessarily clear from one year to the next
Right.
what it's going to be. So,
I actually think the way we're doing linkages now could, in some ways, be more damaging than beneficial. Just because with our inconsistent ability to have board members present and maybe just one, that sends a message. And we could procure the same information with a survey and not require them to take time out of their day and stay after school and find alternative childcare or whatever to attend a language with the board that maybe one person shows up to, and then it's unclear what they're even gonna do about their grievances anyway. I mean, that's a real, like, critical look at the linkages. I feel like I've definitely learned from the linkages and appreciate the in-person connect with staff. So I do think there's benefit to it, but I also see that there are detriments to how they're done and how we do them, especially with the time that works best for teachers is really hard for
Yeah.
most of the board.
Well, that's exactly why I raised the question again, because that was sort of the upshot of our previous discussion, is like within what our role is, the question should be like, to what end, right? And while I value, as Deb does, the chance to like really hear, like, this is the experience, this is what's going on, because it
Yeah.
keeps me connected to that.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like, we're not changing most things. We can ask questions, but like, the administrator who is getting this feedback as well is the one who's in the position to act on it most directly, and should be. And like, and hopefully we are seeing that in our regular work process as well. So I agree with you on the detriments as well, and that's why I raised the question, because I'm of two minds about it.
Yeah,
you know?
I
But-
feel too.
But the Aspen group, their concern was about the linkage with staff. It wasn't
Yeah.
about linkages in general.
Sure, yep. That's mostly what my comments were framed around, was
Okay.
the ones with staff.
Yeah, so I agree with Aaron as well, that like us focusing on, like, I'm a little surprised that we don't have a more like specific relationship with the county board or the city council. Like, it seems like a natural, like, hey, how you doing? Kind of like, here's what we're up to, what are you guys up to?
Senior centers, like
Yeah.
places where people were having a hard time reaching.
Right.
where those
Exactly
folks
that
kind of-
population I asked Nick about,
Correct.
right? Who was like, they don't necessarily have kids in the district, may never have had kids.
Yeah,
They still own these schools, we still need their input,
yeah,
and we may be the answer to that particular problem.
yeah, I think
So,
the externally focused linkages are,
I totally agree with that, yeah.
As a general comment, about the linkages, two things. One is Laura does a great job on the notes. Like, that's a lot of notes, and you do, like, you really capture, like, I don't read these and go, oh my God, she totally missed the point of it. Like, you really do capture it, so kudos to you for that. Second of all, you know, we always start the conversation, what's the barrier? And I don't know, it seems you should start a conversation with something positive. And I think we put the barrier first because a lot of people are there to share that. But what you put at the top of the agenda ends up taking up most of your discussion. So I'd be switching the second question at the first question in the
And
future.
we talked about exactly that, I think.
Tell me something good.
I also think Katie's comment is a good one, and considering if you did a survey, not saying that it's the right answer, but if you were to do a survey, you could then have a workshop to discuss what was found in that survey and the data, and then you could also then add it to your board agenda, so that you can have kind of two bites at the apple, and the public would see you wrestling with it twice, right? Because you would also have a discussion when you accept the linkage notes. So, I mean, there are different ways to handle it, but also just considering that I know in my time on the board, it has been very adamant that this board has never wanted to remove linkages with staff because that has been such an integral part of the district. So, you know, could moving to a survey be viewed as removing linkages with staff? Possibly, but on the flip side, there's also some positives to be gained. So I think it's just again, it gets back to what does this board want to do, and how does it want to handle and value the time, not only of each board member, but of the staff members who are attending those meetings after school, or before school sometimes.
I think the challenge with a survey, I mean, surveys have a value, but I think the context of a comment comes across better in person than in a survey. I think that's what is helpful, is that a lot of the comments that are made, understanding the context behind them is helpful to me to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, sorry, Jim. Jeff,
Oh.
sorry.
Just wanted to kind of add in, with community linkages, I don't think there's any reason why that can't be set up for staff to attend to. So you have community and staff all in the same area. I don't know if that's
I
possible.
think those would be really competing discussions,
It could
you
be.
know, yeah.
Yeah, But then I always, I think I've made it pretty clear on kind of how I feel about linkages, because I don't think it really promotes a trusting basis between administration and staff. And it takes that middleman out of there, so the staff, it's like, okay, we can just skip right over the top of, you know, the director or whatever, and go right to the board. Especially when it's like set up with mostly, it sounds like kind of complaints, so.
But we, at the beginning of
instead of
each linkage,
problem solving.
we read our linkage statement, which I don't have in front of me, but it basically says, you know, we're coherent governance board. Part of the linkage is to get feedback so we can do our job better, but there's a lot of day-to-day stuff we can't do anything about. And so they are well aware of that, that's read at every linkage, and so I think that does help them know, while they maybe don't like about, I'm just gonna pick on cell phones, cause somebody mentioned it
Right.
earlier, like, we can't fix that.
Does that kind of go back to Katie's point, though? Is it doing more damage because you're not able to, you know, provide any
But-
kind of solution?
I mean, the pressure release is a value though, and the ability for them to feel heard is a value as well. But again, like I go back to that exact question of like, to what end though, right? And is there a mechanism by which we could get a broader cross-section of feedback that gives us that kind of ground level look at what are the challenges, what are the joys, what are the priorities that they have, what are they hoping for? I think that's all, that's valuable for us to not be, you know, aloof from what's happening in the schools.
I think the best ones that I've been at is when they follow staff meeting. The whole staff is there then, some people can leave if they have to, but if this whole staff is there rather than just a concentrated number of people that are there. So if we could tie it into a staff meeting, I think that might wider range value.
I think like Juan said, we as a board have to decide what we wanna do going forward, because like, we can talk about this all day, but.
I know.
Which I was just gonna do a time check. You know, it is almost 20 to 9, and we still have the board self-assessment, and we still have a closed session. But point well taken.
Frank, I agree, Tim, I think we're not gonna resolve this tonight. I think it's gonna
Yeah, and
continue.
I didn't mean it like that, I just meant like.
Oh, no, I know, I mean,
We either pull a
take-
Band-Aid or we continue to do these
yeah,
things.
I'm speaking only for myself, like,
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
know,
yeah.
like I said, I'm of two minds, I will probably keep spinning about this for a while,
Yeah.
so I think, yeah.
I think there's more value in it than lack of value. I think we do get something out of it, and the plus and minus on a 10-point scale, I'd say for me it's 7-3.
Other comments? I don't want, you know, I'm sure both Tim and I are the same, like, we're not trying to stifle the conversation,
No,
but we
no,
just
no,
also wanna, you know, be
I gotta-
mindful of time and move forward with the agenda that we have in front of us. So, any final comments on linkages? Okay, then hearing none, we can move on to the self-assessment. You know, and again, staff administration can stay, they don't have to stay, it's totally up to them.
Just board president, would it be possible to table this so that we can have fresher minds for the closed session discussion?
I would be happy to do that.
Okay,
I think this is important, but not as important, I'd
This-
rather have it.
this'll wait.
Quite honestly, I mean, I was hoping to do that. I think that, April 17th,
We have one on April 7th and the 21st.
okay, let's do the 21st.
Is
That would be a
not-
nice,
Cause you're done.
Is that the
no, that'll be
board?
I won't be here on the 7th, and I want to be able to hear
Oh.
the conversation. And the 21st is perfect because it's our last board meeting, so it's a
Right.
perfect way to end is by doing the
With the
self-assessment.
workshop?
Yes.
How do you really feel, Katie?
You all are the ones who make or break the time that we
Okay.
have, right?
This
So,
isn't going anywhere.
All right, well, the School District La Crosse Board of Education will be meeting on Monday, March 17th, 2025, immediately following the Board of Education meeting, Hogan Administrative Center Auditorium, room 209. Pursuant to Wisconsin Statute 19.85, sub 1, sub C, for the purpose of considering employment, promotion, compensation, or performance evaluation data of any public employee over which the governmental body has jurisdiction or exercises responsibility, to wit, the superintendent contract comparables, And so we would need a roll call vote, please, Ms. Steigerwald?
Can I have a motion in a second, please?
So moved.
Second.
There you go.
Thank you. Mr. Alberts?
Aye.
Mr. Vigneski?
Aye.
Ms. Berkedal?
I,
Mr. Manka?
Aye.
Dr. Sprague?
Aye.
Ms. Sukla?
Aye.
Dr. Jimenez?
Aye.